Hello and welcome back to the European Compliance and Ethics Conference 2020. This is the third and final part, and in this part we'll be focusing on whistleblowers. First of all, I'll be interviewing Wendy Addison, and then we'll go into a brief overview of the new EU Whistleblower Protection Directive, then the panel discussion, and at 5:30 we will announce the winner of the ECEC award. But now I'm delighted to speak with our next interview partner.
Our next guest, Wendy Addison, tells her own story as a whistleblower. She reported a major fraud scandal in 1999 at the company in South Africa where she worked as an accountant. Today, she reports about her experiences and advises companies and employees at her own company speak out, speak up. She says, whistleblowing hotlines are not gold. They are barren land that might contain gold.
Hi, Wendy, thank you so much for joining us here today. Now, just to clarify for the audience, you're South African, but you're now based in London. And of course, you didn't start your career as a whistleblower. So can you take us back to the time before you became a whistleblower? What was your role in the company, and give us a little bit of the scale? What was the company? How big was it?
Great. Well, first of all, hello, Tanya. Really great to see you again. I'm really looking forward to the interview. So my role was the international recruiter at LeisureNet Limited. LeisureNet Limited was a public listed company. It was also known as the darling of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And in the year 1999, it was poised to list on the London Stock Exchange as well as the Australian Stock Exchange. So this was a much loved, it looked like a really successful company. But that began with one of the biggest lies of the organization. And that was really how the company recognized its revenue. They did a lot of what we call shimmering, upfronting, and so the company looked really hot to trot. But in fact, it was very much a theatre of success. There were vanity metrics that said a lot, but actually did nothing. My role was that I reported directly into the joint CEOs, who effectively reported into the board of directors.
Wendy, how long did you work at LeisureNet, and also what happened in your company? When did you recognize that something was going wrong?
Ultimately, I was there for 9 years, Tanya. And this is an important question that you ask because, the company showed elements of lawful but awful behavior very early on. So it didn't cross the line and become illegal malfeasance. But it certainly was pushing the envelope to the end, to the sort of edge of things. And very briefly, because a very important part of my story is that my first conscious opportunity that I felt I was being given to speak up was when the company began something called the scroll sheets. And that was pretty innocuous. It was to give the golden girls and the golden boys the opportunity to go and expend something personal every month, bring the slips back, and then offset that against our salaries. And of course, the benefit for us would be that we would be paying less income tax. And very quickly, over a period of time, whilst most of our senior executives were purchasing stationery for our children, maybe a beach trip or going out to the cinema, those kind of expenses, the joint CEOs began huge amounts of expenditure. First, sort of crystal crockery for £10,000 each. That escalated to vehicles for their children. That escalated to yachts for each of them. And then finally, £7 million houses for each of them. And, along this scale, I've asked myself, if this had escalated more quickly, would I have spoken up? But because it was such a nebulous, slippery slope, and nobody within our senior executive team, who were all very technically competent, but perhaps not morally competent, nobody spoke up. So, we talk about speaking up having costs. Silence has costs too.
I know that you try to bring it up internally. What happened when you tried to speak up?
Oh, no amount of legislation or policy can mitigate the psychological conflict anybody goes through when you're about to speak up. And I remember thundering down the corridor to the Joint CEO's offices. And remember, these were friends of mine, not just colleagues. And, I wasn't mastered. I couldn't master the skill of speaking up effectively or having my message land effectively. And so, if really, my emotions had me and I didn't have my emotions. So, when I tried to address or tell the joint CEOs that I wouldn't be complicit in this transaction that they had instructed me to push forward, um, my shrill narrative was really locked down very effectively by them reminding me of my own vulnerability and their power. And that really was the sort of implicit consensus within the organization that didn't really want to hear complaints. They didn't want to hear bad news. And so, for anybody wanting to speak up, it's incredibly challenging. And the reason why people speak up the chain of command is because we feel that we don't have the power ourselves to change something. It's incredibly difficult.
What sort of compliance program was in place at the time, if any?
Well, that's a really interesting question because in South Africa, we had just got the King's corporate governance coming into South Africa. And it was this new, shiny model of corporate governance. And most corporations in South Africa had the great intention to keep it polished and clean. So, whilst we had this framework of corporate governance, it remains mere scaffolding until you actually change or invoke the right behaviors to climb that scaffolding. So, whilst we had the corporate governance in place, we also had a wonderful board of executives. We had 7 chartered accountants on there. We had various MBAs. We had a medical doctor. We had very qualified people on our board of directors. We also had one of the big 4 doing our audit. That was Deloitte's. And we also had separate committees within our board. So a separate remuneration committee, a separate internal audit committee, a separate chairman's committee. So again, if you look at the picture of LeisureNet, we were really hot to trot, and stakeholders couldn't wait to fill their boots with this organization's shares.
Okay, so you had a compliance program of sorts, then it boils down to individual behaviors. Why do you think top management acted in a corrupt way? What were the behavioral drivers?
These are such good questions, Tanya. Thank you so much for asking them. When I look back on my experience, the 9 years that I was there were no monsters lurking in the corridors waiting to rob the company. That certainly wasn't the case. What I believe happened is when we listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the joint CEOs, who had been the founding members of this darling company, felt that the board of directors were a handbrake to them. And they felt that they had lost their independence and their power to somewhat. And now we know from our empirical neurological research that power is very seductive, it's very addictive. So they felt they'd lost their power, they felt they'd lost their independence. And as a result, they began to keep information back from the board of directors. And nobody really, and just I'm talking to ourselves as a senior management team, nobody really asked the right questions. None of us at that point in time had the courage to really ask the difficult questions of the joint CEOs. And so they, in a kind of blindsided way, we gave them tacit permission to escalate their bad behavior. And there's another thing that I want to talk about, and that is the natural loss aversion that we all want to avoid. Nobody likes to lose their status. Nobody likes to lose their jobs, their money, their qualifications, their family. And I think with the joint CEOs, they had a huge amount of skin in the game, but they felt, now reporting into a board of directors, that they had lost something. And they did everything that they could, even in the name of illegality, to get that back again, to get their power back again.
Do you think there could have been anything in the compliance and ethics program to stop them now in hindsight? What would you have added to it?
You know, all of this, back then in the year 1999 and today, talks about behavior and character. And character is what underpins the disposition to lead and to govern and to move people towards better behavior. And I think this is a big piece, this behavioral piece is a big piece that is missed in the narratives around whistleblowing and compliance programs. So what we've got is a tick box mechanism. It's very mechanical, it's very operational, but it misses out the whole fundamental part of who we are as people, not only individually, but in our group contexts as well. And you know, even in the sort of narrative of whistleblowing that I operate within, there's a huge amount of conversation around legislation and policies and compliance and how we're going to punish people and what we're going to do with whistleblowers. But there's very little conversation around how we're going to empower people, actually give them the skills to speak up. How are we going to empower people to listen up when it actually doesn't seem to be in their own individual best actions?
You tried to bring up the issues internally. You came across deaf ears. What was the next step? What happened then?
I remember going back into my office, my very plush senior executive office, I must say, and I really recognized I had been met with a moral dilemma. And I felt my sort of considerations were, do I still continue singing Kumbaya with my teammates, pretending nothing was happening? Do I look the other way, like most of us are taught to do, quite frankly? Or do I consider my social contract with humanity and all stakeholders, not just the shareholders and the company? And it was at that point that I elected to call the South African Exchange Control Board, because we had a very strict legal caveat with them. And the instructions from the joint CEOs for a transaction, for me to transact, would be in complete illegal breach with that caveat. And then I phoned the South African authorities. I did it anonymously. But here's the thing, you know, as I spoke earlier about this very polished version of corporate governance, I think the South African Exchange Control Board were very keen to signal and demonstrate that when they got a call like this, they would act on it very swiftly. And they traced the phone call to the building and did a dawn raid on LeisureNet Limited.
What was the immediate outcome for you after you made that call?
I was terrified, you know, and this really also brings home this sense of self-preservation. I had always believed myself to be a good, loyal member, team member of the organization. And now it really felt that I'd done something incredibly disloyal. You know, I'd always felt that I was a compliant individual. And now it really felt like I'd done something incredibly non-compliant, and which was going to make people very uncomfortable. So this notion of one's self-preservation comes into stark challenge. It almost felt like I was hiding in this little rickety hut and there was a hurricane coming. And everything had to do with about what I believed or who I believed I was and how different the outcome was going to be. So when the dawn raid happened, they were very quickly able to identify that I would have been the person that had made that phone call, and subsequently got fired, lost my job, lost my career, and pretty much lost my livelihood.
So you left as well, didn't you? You went to London.
Yeah, you know, sorry, I didn't hear that.
What was your motivation to leave South Africa?
Okay, so, and again, this is about loss aversion, right? So after being fired, I began to get death threats. And my son, who was 12 at the time, we both received this very vitriolic death threats. And in a South African context, it was more like a probability than a possibility that we would not survive those death threats. And the only thing that I could do at that point in time was to flee South Africa, my homeland, and put myself in self-imposed exile in the UK.
What happened then? What were the consequences for the company? I mean, did you feel that you got justice? Was that quite a swift process?
I wouldn't use swift, Tanya. It took me 11 years to secure justice. But this is all that whistleblowers ask for, because it gives us a line in the sand. And I'm not sure how many examples out there are of whistleblowers who have secured justice, where people have gone to jail. And so for my whistleblowing case, even though it took 11 years, the joint CEOs were sent to jail. And, for me as the whistleblower, that was justice, and it allowed me to draw this line and rebuild myself thereafter.
Would you say now, what can companies do to encourage their employees to speak up?
Okay, this is a really important one. I wish we had more time. It's not so much about encouragement. I want to use the word empower. When I go into organizations, I see wonderful intentions with the mission statement, the value statements, the purpose of the organization. That's great, but we can't vow to speak up when we haven't developed the skill and the narrative and the handrails of how to do that. And the same applies to listening up as well. It's incredibly difficult for a senior executive to listen up to something he or she might have thought they might have come across, and their self-efficacy is impacted. So it's really going back to training people, upskilling them to be able to speak up and listen up before they have to become a whistleblower. Because you know what? Nobody aspires to become a whistleblower.
That doesn't surprise me, Wendy. Now, going back to the topic of justice a little bit, what do you think about settlements as a way of dealing with corporate fraud or other compliance breaches? Is that justice?
I don't think so. I feel, that if we turn back the clock and we say, what do whistleblowers want? Why do they actually put their lives, their careers at risk? They want to stop an unethical practice. It is simple as that. They want to alert the organization to an unethical practice. That is the call to action. When they end up in an employment tribunal fighting for their jobs, that is not justice. So these settlement agreements, first of all, could possibly be signaling to potential people that you want to speak up that there's no value in doing so, because the company will just dig deep into their budgets, and believe me, do budgets for settlements to pay the settlement. There's not much academic research or literature around how effective any reforms are, or any reforms that are taken by organizations to change the climate and culture within that organization. To pay something, money is just a sort of a fungibility utility. It pays somebody, but it doesn't actually really change anything at the core, the essence of the organization.
That leads on to something you were saying about the consequences for the whistleblower. First of all, goes through the employment tribunal, and you would like to see it being addressed in the criminal justice courts. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking there?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. In my work with whistleblowers all over the world, I'm really conscious how the public's eye is pulled away from the malfeasance, from the criminal act within the organization, to the whistleblower in an employment tribunal. the question arises, why is the whistleblower in an employment tribunal? A labor court has nothing to do with the unethical practice that the person spoke out about. So, each judicial domain has different places where they operate, and they are given mightier powers according to the domain in which they operate. And I feel that because whistleblowing is sitting under the labor laws, the employment laws, there isn't enough gravitas to actually not only protect the whistleblower, but also to take action against the key players within the unethical practice within the organization. It really needs to be shifted somewhere where it matters.
Wendy, we've got a question that's getting a lot of attention from our viewers, and this has something to do with the experience as a whistleblower within Europe. Now, the person who sent in the question says they work for a group with a lot of subsidiaries in Europe, and the adherence to the whistleblower system depends a lot on the domestic culture. Can we talk about a European whistleblower experience at the moment? What would be typical in Europe?
I think cultures are made up of attitudes, mindsets, belief systems, the way people are brought up within their countries. And absolutely, this is correct to address the cultures within organizations and within countries, jurisdiction specific. And again, I want to go back to behaviors, individuals' behaviors, rather than just putting a blanket policy in place with the expectation that everybody will engage with that policy or that law in the same way. I know from my own experience, having lived in Africa, how different the culture there is and the attitude towards whistle compared to perhaps in other European countries. And then, of course, within Europe itself, as the person asking the question has identified, it's not just about jurisdiction that matters. It absolutely matters in terms of what are the cultures, the attitudes, the mindsets towards whistleblowing and towards whistleblowers themselves. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around this.
Talking about settlements from the whistleblowing point of view, from the whistleblower's point of view, do you think whistleblowers should be compensated?
This is a hot topic. I'm normally asked, should whistleblowers be rewarded? I like your wording, compensation. I absolutely believe whistleblowers should be compensated. There's a huge loss involved. It's not just financial loss, it's emotional, psychological, mental health, family loss as well. And again, back to this loss aversion, it's a big part of who we are as a species. So compensation is a very important part of this. Perhaps even addressing reskilling, upskilling whistleblowers into a different profession so that they can actually navigate a different occupation, a different career from the time they've been whistleblowers. But the reward system, the bounty scheme, I'm not in favor of. Whistleblowers need more radical justice. We don't need more radical rewards. We're not looking for rewards. And I think at the end of the day, whistleblowers ultimately could become mere sort of agents of an external agency who values a whistleblowing's disclosure only by how much money is involved. So what's the financial incentive for the agency to follow through? So compensation, absolutely yes. Perhaps upskilling, rewards, I wouldn't go with that kind of thinking.
Okay. Going back to Dr. Klaus Morsmeyer's presentation at the beginning of the day, he's the Chief Compliance Officer for Novartis. He stated that Novartis is prioritizing values over financial performance. What do you think are the key indicators that a company is actually doing that?
I am so excited to hear that, Tanya. Recently, I've been working a lot in the ESG space. And there's a huge focus on organizational purpose. What is your purpose and who is your client? I would suggest are primary questions for the leaders of organizations. And again, going back to the legislation around whistleblowing, whistleblowers speak up in the public interest. And ESG does this wonderful dovetail between the public interest and all stakeholders' interests. So your client at the end of the day is the public interest. Your client at the end of the day are all stakeholders. And I would suggest build your organizational purpose to embed and bake in that mindset, because then it makes a more natural mindset for someone speaking up to go, all stakeholders matter to me. The purpose has identified in the public interest. I'm going to speak up in their favor. So the purpose of an organization is primary in terms of who are you protecting? Who are you listening to? Who are you serving?
Thank you for those insights, Wendy. One final question from the audience, and it's a very personal question, because I know that you went through great suffering. After you blew the whistle in South Africa, you went into exile in London, and I've heard you say in an interview that you were begging on the streets in London. I mean, it was really dire. And you've made a huge success out of your journey, but that was your own personal strength. The question from the audience, though, is, would you do it again?
It's an important question. I think I would. I think there's something about the character of people that want to speak up. I think at the core of their character is that they care. They care about the organization. They care about themselves. They care about their teams. And they care about the public. I don't think that essence, that part of myself has changed. So I think I would still be compelled to want to speak up. However, I would have done it differently. I would certainly have spoken up earlier on if I had been given the skills to be able to do that. So speaking up informally at the score sheet time when they were escalating their expenses, I believe could have changed the trajectory of that organization. The second thing I would have done is, we all talk about groupthink as a negative, but when you're about to speak up, you're not alone. Bring people along with you. So many whistleblowers say, I was the only one who saw the malfeasance. No, you didn't. Other people have seen. Bring them with you. And then thirdly, know your rights and respect the rights of the organization as well. You can get into very hot water when you step over GDPR and privacy rules and things like that. Reach out to organizations like my own, reach out to maybe organizations within your jurisdiction to ensure that you know what you're doing in the legal frame before you speak up or blow the whistle.
Wendy, your company Speak Up, Speak Out, you've just mentioned it. What do you focus on?
Thanks for asking, Tanya. Sure, I can train around whistleblowing legislation and policy. Absolutely willing to do talks around being a moral exemplar for people to speak up. But my real focus is training and upskilling so that individuals can speak up and listen up before anyone needs to become a whistleblower. And that is via a module called Courageous Conversations, which was built out of Stanford University, to which I attended. So it's a social psych module. It's like a CBT module that actually provides and empowers people with the actual skills of how to do this before any whistleblowing needs to occur.
Wendy, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your insights and your absolutely personal journey. We'll be seeing each other in the panel discussion in a little bit.